On a rain-soaked evening in the mountainous borderlands of what would one day become Austria, a metalsmith named Albrecht von Steyr stood alone in his forge, watching the dying embers of a fire that had consumed his entire fortune. It was 1356, a time when most warriors wielded swords that looked like oversized daggers, weapons that required a shield in the other hand, armour on the body, and, frankly, a lot of luck. Albrecht had everything to lose and nothing left to prove. He was 53 years old, his wife had died the winter before, and his apprentice had run off to join a mercenary band. He had one reason to keep working: obsession. For 15 years, Albrecht had been haunted by a single moment. During a skirmish between local nobles, he had watched a young knight get surrounded, trapped. The warrior could neither raise his shield high enough nor swing his sword wide enough to create distance between himself and his 4 attackers. He died on his knees, and Albrecht realized something that night. The weapons of the world had become inadequate for the chaos of real battle. That evening in 1356, fumbling in the darkness with materials he'd salvaged from a riverbed, Albrecht made a mistake. He accidentally welded 2 iron plates together instead of hammering them flat. He almost threw them into the forge in frustration. The loss of precious material, time wasted. But he paused. The double-layer construction, when he held it up to the firelight, was rigid in a way single sheets weren't. Flexible, yes, but not flimsy. His mind, trained by 4 decades of metalworking, began to race. What if he built an entire blade with this principle? He didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the next. Part 2. The First Blade. Modern historians, sitting comfortably in their universities with access to steel specifications and metallurgical charts, often miss the most important part of innovation. It's terrifying. Albrecht wasn't working from a blueprint. He was working from intuition, fever dreams, and the desperate belief that he had glimpsed something true in that moment of accidental creation. The first blade took him 4 months. He worked in secrecy, not because he feared competition, but because he feared ridicule. In 1356, Europe's finest blade makers were in Italy, Spain, and the German Rhine Valley. A broke metalsmith working alone in the Austrian mountains? If his experiment became known and failed, he would be laughed out of every marketplace from Salzburg to Nuremberg. Worse, someone with more resources might steal his idea and perfect it, without ever crediting the obsessed old man who'd started it all. The blade he eventually pulled from his forge measured 36 inches from point to crossguard. The handle extended another 16 inches, wrapped in rough leather. The weight was perfectly balanced, approximately 3.5 pounds, which is incredibly, almost exactly what a modern longsword weighs. He hadn't measured it scientifically, he'd felt it. His body had become his laboratory. But the revolutionary part wasn't the length. It was the cross-section. Albrecht had created a blade with a hexagonal profile, a central ridge that prevented the sword from flexing laterally, while still allowing it to bend and move vertically. It was elegant. It was deadly. More importantly, it was theoretically possible to use with one hand. When he held that first blade, Albrecht wept. He was an old man who had just changed the world, and he didn't yet know it. Part 3. The burden of proof. Having made the sword was one thing. Proving it worked was another. Albrecht couldn't challenge a local knight to a duel that would draw attention and possibly get him arrested or worse. Instead, he began working with mercenaries and soldiers passing through his region. He offered them the swords at a discount, sometimes for free, with one condition. They had to come back and tell him exactly what happened when they used them. The stories came back slowly at first, then in a flood. A mercenary named Klaus, fighting in a skirmish near Linz, reported that his longsword had allowed him to fight 2 men simultaneously for the first time in his career. Not that he won, he didn't, but he'd lasted longer, moved faster, adapted better. Another warrior, a grizzled veteran named Heinrich, said the weapon felt like an extension of his arm in a way his old sword never had. A younger fighter named Dietmar brought the blade back 3 times in 6 months, each time asking for repairs, each time begging for another one to keep as a backup. Then came the demonstration that changed everything. In the summer of 1359, a nobleman's court hosted a martial competition. Albrecht, now known locally as the sword maker, was invited to display his work. There were dozens of contestants' men-at-arms, knights, experienced fighters from half a dozen territories. The competition was chaotic, brutal, and real. No rules governed the matches. Victory meant survival. A young fighter named Georg, whom Albrecht had outfitted with one of his longswords, walked into that arena. Georg wasn't the strongest man there. He wasn't the most experienced or the tallest or the most heavily armoured. But he had the longsword. In match after match, Georg controlled the distance between himself and his opponents in ways they couldn't match. The longsword's reach was greater than their shorter blades, but not so much greater that it was cumbersome. Georg could attack, defend, and reposition with fluid efficiency. He won 6 fights in a single day. 6. The crowd, confused at first, began to understand what they were witnessing. A fundamental change in how warfare could be conducted. By evening, every nobleman in attendance wanted a longsword. The secret was out. Part 4. The Revolution. What followed would reshape medieval warfare. Within 5 years of that first demonstration, longswords had begun appearing in Switzerland, Bavaria, and the neighbouring provinces. Within 15 years they were spreading across the continent. By the end of the 1300s, the longsword had become one of the most sought-after weapons in Europe. But here's what makes Albrecht's story remarkable. The weapon he invented was so fundamentally sound that it remained largely unchanged for the next 300 years. A sword made in 1380 functioned almost identically to a sword made in 1650. Few inventions can claim such longevity. The genius of the longsword was that it solved multiple problems simultaneously. It gave fighters reach without sacrificing control. It allowed a mounted warrior to fight effectively without a shield. It could be used one-handed against a single opponent and two-handed for maximum power against multiple foes or heavily armoured targets. It worked against both armoured and unarmoured opponents. It was the Swiss Army knife of medieval weaponry, and Albrecht had designed it without ever knowing what a Swiss Army knife was. More importantly, the longsword democratized combat in a subtle but profound way. A strong knight with a shield and short sword still had advantages in direct single combat. But a skilled fighter with a longsword and a strong arm wasn't even strictly necessary could compete with that knight. Technique mattered more, speed mattered more, intelligence mattered more. The physics of the weapon rewarded precision and discipline over pure strength and wealth. Military theorists immediately understood the implications. Training programs shifted. Fencing masters began developing new methodologies specifically for the longsword. By the early 1400s, entire schools of swordplay had emerged, the German style, the Italian style, the Spanish style, each attempting to unlock the weapon's full potential. Part 5. The Forgotten Inventor. Albrecht von Steyr never grew rich from his invention. This might be the most tragic and important part of the story. He did become famous among warriors and smiths, certainly. Young metal workers came from across Europe to study with him, though by then he was in his 60s, prone to arthritis and cataracts. He trained perhaps 24 craftsmen in the basics of his technique, but he never wrote down his methods. Knowledge in that era was jealously guarded, passed down orally from master to apprentice, encrypted in the muscle memory of practice. Albrecht died in 1378, at the age of 75, still living in his modest cottage in the Austrian mountains. He left no great fortune, no monuments, no university bearing his name. His apprentices scattered across Europe, taking his techniques with them, but each one adapted and modified slightly, improving where they could, adding their own touches. Within 2 generations, no one could say with certainty exactly who had invented the longsword or how. It became attributed to nameless masters of old and ancient craftsmen. This anonymity is actually fitting in a way. The longsword became so foundational to European warfare that it transcended individual authorship. It belonged to everyone and no one. It was perfected by hundreds of fighters and thousands of smiths over the centuries, each contribution incremental but essential. Part 6. The Legacy Jump Forward to 1429. Joan of Arc is leading French armies into battle. The soldiers fighting in those battles, including those defending against her forces, wielded longswords. The weapon Albrecht forged in 1356 had become the standard of European warfare. Jump forward to 1588. The Spanish Armada is defeated off the coast of England. British sailors and soldiers, many of them carrying longswords as secondary weapons, are among the victors. 3 centuries after Albrecht's death, his invention is still determining the outcome of continental conflicts. Jump forward to 1815, the Napoleonic Wars end. Longswords are finally being phased out of most military arsenals, replaced by bayonets and rifles. But the sword had ruled European battlefields for nearly half a millennium. No single invention of that era had a longer period of dominant use. Epilogue. Why it matters. The story of Albrecht von Steyr matters because it illustrates a fundamental truth about history. The greatest innovations often come not from genius working in isolation, but from necessity, desperation, and the willingness to fail repeatedly. Albrecht didn't have resources or connections. He had an obsession and the metallurgical knowledge to pursue it. An accident in his forge led him to a discovery. He tested it against the harsh judgment of real combat, and he released it into the world without attachment to credit or wealth. The longsword was a perfect weapon not because one man made it perfect, but because one man made it possible, and then hundreds of generations of warriors refined it through the terrible school of actual warfare. In many ways, Albrecht never really invented the longsword. He simply opened a door that countless warriors and smiths would walk through for the next 3 centuries, each of them adding something, each of them believing they were creating something new when in fact they were all collaborators in Albrecht's original vision. And that perhaps is the truest mark of a genuine innovation. Not that one person gets the credit, but that the world thousands of people across generations takes what you started and makes it better than you ever could have imagined. Albrecht von Steyr died in obscurity in a small Austrian cottage, probably never knowing that the simple blade he'd forged would outlive empires.